The film commences with the NSA conducting satellite scans, searching for a terrorist named Lucas Wade. The operation is being overseen by Bob, the agency's chief analyst. Captain Jane Lee, a military psychiatrist stationed at Camp Black Horse, is on a video call with her young daughter Samantha, who is back in the United States celebrating Christmas with her other mother, Beth. Jane, aware of the time, ends the call reluctantly as she needs to catch her transport. Just before leaving, a soldier named Adams comes to see Jane, handing her a Christmas card. He becomes emotional, and even though she is running late, Jane decides to stay and talk with him, providing comfort. After their conversation, Jane heads out to catch her transport, but is approached by NSA agent Whitney Smith, who offers to give her a lift. As they drive, Jane talks about her daughter, sharing how much she's looking forward to being home for Christmas. However, Whitney eventually reveals that she needs Jane to come with her, assuring her that she's not in any trouble. Jane is hesitant, having spent 18 months without leave, and is determined not to miss Christmas with her family. Despite her protests, Whitney takes her to a plane bound for a secret facility called Black Site Indigo. Upon arrival, Jane is greeted by Director Stevens, who explains that the NSA is drowning in information. Although they have an abundance of data, they still need a human mind to process it, which is why Jane is there, to provide therapeutic support. Stevens leads Jane to the central processing area and introduces her to Bob, who turns out to be a massive living brain connected to a surveillance system. Bob, the chief intelligence officer, has been grown from nutrient-enriched meat and has a camera eye that allows him to communicate. He already knows everything about Jane and introduces himself. Chris, the tech overseeing Bob, explains that the NSA created this organic intelligence to analyze data in ways that conventional computers cannot. Bob knows why Jane has been brought to the facility and insists he doesn't need therapy. However, Jane believes that talking with him could help Bob cope with his issues, which might in turn help him find Lucas Wade. When they mention Lucas, Bob reacts with discomfort, struggling to process the name and expressing pain. The sight of Bob's enormous pulsating mass of tissue makes Jane nauseous, and she ends up vomiting. Outside, Stevens tells Jane that they need her to start working immediately. She shows Jane footage of Lucas blowing up a Christmas tree, explaining that he is planning another attack, but they don't know where or when. Since no physical issues have been found with Bob, they suspect his trouble is psychological. Stevens emphasizes that although they can't force Jane to stay, they need her expertise. She points out that Jane has already extended her tour 3 times voluntarily, implying that Jane can't ignore someone in pain. Jane reluctantly agrees to stay. Later, Jane contacts Beth and Samantha over a video call to explain that she won't be coming home for Christmas after all, with Samantha running off in tears. Beth tells Jane that she should focus on being there for Bob if she can't be there for her family, and then abruptly ends the call. Shortly after, Bob reaches out to Jane, appearing on her TV screen. Annoyed by this invasion of privacy, Jane tells him to leave her alone and switches off the TV. But Bob is persistent. He even sends a drone to her window to continue the conversation, stating that he doesn't want her there. Jane points out that his behavior seems like a cry for help, and in response, Bob mischievously triggers the sprinkler system in her room and locks the door, effectively cutting off their interaction. The next day, after drying her clothes, Jane heads back to talk to Bob. She jokes that she was trying to sneak a cigarette, which set off the sprinklers, surprising Bob that she's covering for him. Stevens sends everyone else out, leaving Jane and Bob alone. Jane admits that their first encounter didn't go well, but she wants to start fresh. Bob, still skeptical, compares her to an earthworm, implying she's insignificant compared to him. Jane agrees but insists that she wants to try and help. She asks for just 2 hours, promising that if Bob still doesn't want to talk after that, she'll leave him alone. Bob agrees, but deducts the time she was late from the 2 hours. Jane then tries various techniques to get Bob to open up, starting with word association and gradually moving to deeper questions. She asks Bob to describe how Lucas managed to disappear off a subway a month ago, something that has been troubling him since. Bob's attempt to express emotions comes off as awkward and unconvincing, but Jane keeps probing, asking how he felt about losing track of Lucas. Bob tries to change the subject, avoiding any emotional discussion. At one point, Bob expresses a wish to reach out to a man named Herb Hillman, who is building something for his wife, and says he'd like to know what it is. Before they can explore this thought, Bob suddenly interrupts to report spotting a potential suspect. Stevens orders a drone strike, which takes out the target but also kills 3 innocent bystanders. Later, Jane suggests that Bob might be experiencing a form of psychosomatic blindness regarding Lucas. She points out that Bob is under immense stress, and despite his advanced abilities, he's still a sentient being with vulnerabilities. Bob grows defensive, trying to shut down the conversation. Jane asks how it felt to execute the drone strike, and Bob snaps, saying Jane is bothering him. Quickly regaining his composure, Bob brings up a live video feed of Samantha and Beth, showing that they're fine without Jane. He tells her that she needs to feel needed, a remark that strikes a nerve. Bob goes on to express pity for Jane, stating that her time is up. Jane, however, seizes on this, noting that pity stems from empathy and compassion. She argues that Bob must have deep feelings if he's capable of pity, and asks what it's like to feel compassion for 7 billion people. In response, Bob starts showing her footage from around the world, revealing scenes of Lucas eating a donut on the subway, interspersed with moments of everyday sadness and misery. Bob confesses that he has been overwhelmed with these feelings of sorrow ever since he was activated, and it's like he's been crying internally. Finally, Bob manages to locate footage of Lucas leaving the subway, trying once more to track him electronically. The video flickers and cuts out, and it becomes clear to Stevens and Chris, who have rushed back in, that Bob's condition is deteriorating. Bob, his voice filled with resignation, tells them that they are already too late. On the crowded subway train, Lucas discreetly plants a gift-wrapped present on a seat. Inside, it's not a regular Christmas gift, it's a bomb. As he exits the train, a man notices the unattended package and calls out, asking if anyone left it behind. No one claims it, and moments later the bomb explodes, devastating the train and taking many innocent lives. Bob, the organic intelligence system, scrambles to analyze the situation. Despite his best efforts, Bob loses track of Lucas entirely, failing to locate him. Frustrated and overwhelmed, Bob apologizes, acknowledging that he has lost control. Director Stevens, disgusted by the outcome, silently leaves the room, while Jane decides to step out for a moment to get some tea and clear her mind. Stevens approaches her, and Jane confidently insists that they can still find Lucas, but Stevens coldly informs her that she's been dismissed from the mission. When Jane asks about Bob, Stevens tells her that Bob is no longer her concern. She reveals that the Joint Chiefs of Staff have ordered Bob's deactivation. Stevens tells Jane that it's Christmas Eve and advises her to go home. Following the orders, Chris begins the process to shut him down. Jane, back in her room, packs her belongings. Suddenly, Chris arrives at her door, explaining that Bob has requested to speak with her one last time. Without hesitation, Jane heads to the processing room. When Jane arrives, Bob speaks softly, telling her that he can only hear her now. He asks if she considers him a friend. Jane, holding back tears, assures him that he is. She admits that Bob was right about her. She needs to feel needed by others, and now she feels like she's failed. People have died. Bob is about to be deactivated, and she wasn't able to help either of them. Moved by her vulnerability, Bob calls her closer, and as she leans in, he tells her that she isn't useless. She's human. Jane clings to him, crying, and promises to stay with him until the end. She asks him one more time if he could have one wish, what it would be. Bob responds with a simple yet poignant wish. He wishes there really was a Santa Claus. Inspired, Jane rushes to the Christmas party where she finds Chris and urges him to turn Bob back on. Chris hesitates, pointing out that he can't do that, but Jane insists. She tells him that she has spent her whole life caring for dying soldiers, and she's determined to do everything she can to save Bob. Chris finally agrees. The alarms blare as Chris and Jane head to the processing room to reactivate Bob. Despite Bob's warnings not to proceed, saying that it won't save her or change anything, Bob is brought back online, and immediately he begins observing the world once more. One of the first scenes he sees is Herb Hillman, a man telling his wife how she's the pillar of his life while he works on a physical pillar for their home. Suddenly, Bob realizes something crucial. He's no longer constrained by the NSA's rules. As he processes this freedom, he warns Jane and Chris that they're risking jail time. At a nearby shipping warehouse, Bob sends out an order and hundreds of drones spring to life loaded with over 400,000 Christmas presents. In the dark of the night, the drones disperse, delivering the gifts down chimneys and onto doorsteps across the world. As they spread cheer, Bob doesn't stop there. He uses his newfound freedom to pay off thousands of loans, bringing relief to people struggling with debt. Meanwhile, a small stocking lands inside Lucas's hideout. Intrigued, Lucas opens it and finds a piece of coal inside, just as FBI agents burst through the door and arrest him. Back at the facility, Stevens storms into the processing room, demanding to know what's happening. Chris informs her that Bob now has control of the system, and Bob calmly explains that he is spreading $200 billion worth of Christmas cheer. He reveals that he has managed to stabilize the economy and even managed to deliver Lucas directly to the FBI as a Christmas gift for Stevens. Bob insists that Jane and Chris should not face any consequences for their actions, reminding Stevens that he has control over the nuclear arsenal, making him quite persuasive. Later, the mood in the processing room shifts to one of celebration. People come together, including Chris, who hugs Bob. Stevens then informs Bob that both Jane and Chris have received full presidential pardons. Bob responds, stating that for one night, Santa Claus was real. As the festivities come to a close, Whitney drives Jane home. Before they part, she hands Jane a phone, telling her there's a call. It's Bob, ensuring that she would not miss saying goodbye to her family, and she walks up to the door, where Beth answers. Samantha rushes forward and hugs her tightly, united once again just in time for Christmas.